So if you're an FX6 owner and you're like me and you either need or want a B cam because it either is a requirement of the jobs you get, or it just kind of makes things easier to have another camera to cut to, and it really does help in a lot of edits. We could do another video on why you should have 2 camera setups on just about everything you do. It's not a requirement on everything. And maybe some of you have already guessed this, but my B cam I've chosen for my FX6 is the A7 IV. And I will explain to you why I think this is one of the best B cam cameras you can get for the Sony FX6 when it comes to trying to stick to a budget. So let's get this out of the way. The best B cam to your A cam is another A cam. So the best B camera to the Sony FX6 is going to be another Sony FX6. But let's say you don't want to shell out another $6,000 for another body when it's not necessary for every shoot, or you just really don't have the budget to spend but need that B cam now. So I do get asked by some people why I bought the A7 IV and not an FX30 when I was talking about getting a budget B cam. Well, the FX30 wasn't out yet when I bought the A7 IV, and honestly, I still would buy the A7 IV over the FX30 if you can swing it. But if you're really on a budget, the FX30 is going to be a great B cam, I'm sure. So at the time, I wanted an FX3 to my FX6 because I thought that would be a killer duo to have, and it really would be. If you could swing it, honestly, I think having an FX3 and an FX6 instead of 2 FX6s would probably be more versatile, but that's very personal to you and what you need and what you want, what you're looking for in an A and B camera. But the A7 IV, I bought because we do a lot of hybrid shooting too, but I wasn't looking for a photo camera. But it would be nice to have a second one that can take good photos. But first off, I wanted a full frame E-mount. Okay, so the A7 IV obviously is an E-mount and is full frame, but not only that, the Sony A7 IV shoots S-Log3 in 10-bit 422, and so does the FX6 shoots in 10-bit 422. So I wanted a camera that was as close as possible, sticking with the same manufacturer, and get the closest color science to each other so it'd be easier to match in post. And in my opinion, these match up pretty well, but I will tell you right now, they do not match straight out of camera, and it does take some color correcting to get them to look alike. And both these cameras have S-Cinetone, which honestly, I don't find myself using much nowadays anymore, but I wanted S-Cinetone for those jobs that have that quick turnaround and maybe just some BTS content as well too. Sometimes the job doesn't require color grading, you just need something quick, or the client just needs something like the next day, and you don't have time to do a lot of post-processing. But honestly, I really enjoy it. I've gotten pretty efficient at color grading, so I don't even use S-Cinetone anymore. But I do want to talk about how the colors look on each of these cameras. So here are some shots I did with a color chart. So try to expose these perfect on each one. And I try to make this as, and I'm going to put air quotes, scientific as possible to get the closest representation of the color straight out of the camera to show you what I'm talking about. So right off the bat, looking at these two shots, before we get into the color, I do want to point out the Sony A7 IV is significantly sharper than the FX6, and that is due to I believe it's a 6K or 7K downsample of the sensor. So with it being a hybrid camera taking photos as well, it is a 33 megapixel sensor. So it's going to be significantly sharper than the FX6's closer to 12 megapixel sensor. There are some trade-offs with the differences there too. It doesn't necessarily make the FX6 image worse, but the A7 IV is sharper if that's something you're looking for, something to consider. But because of the pixel sizes on the FX6 is going to do better in low light. It's going to have more of a cleaner image, where the A7 IV will, I don't want to say struggle, because this thing is an awesome camera in low light too as well. Almost any modern camera is going to do pretty good in low light these days. At the point of making this video, the FX6 is probably the best camera you can get for low light filmmaking or content creation. So both cameras were set to S-Log3, S-Gamut3 Cine, and were exposed as close as I can get them to being the same. In these two shots, I can see that the FX6 definitely has more dynamic range than the A7 IV. Sony says the FX6 is rated at 15 plus stops of dynamic range, and the A7 IV is at 14 stops of dynamic range. And I can see there is a difference here. The FX6 definitely has more dynamic range and more detail in the shadows than the A7 IV. But I do feel like the FX6 has more of a green shift, ever so slightly a green shift in S-Log. And the A7 IV seemed a little more magenta. But another thing I do want to mention, when you're looking at these side by sides, it does make the slight differences seem more extreme, but that's because you're looking at them side by side. And this differences in color in S-Log3 between the A7 IV and the FX6, one might actually seem more magenta, and the other one might seem more green, but the other one might look more natural. And then one being shifted another direction might make the other seem a little more extreme. And then I also did an S-Cinetone test between these to look at them side by side. And this, I've never actually looked at them side by side like this. And I thought this was interesting. Now, this is the same color science from the same brand manufacturer as Cinetone from Sony. And you can see here, there is a clear difference between them two, even though it's the same picture profile. And this is something to keep in mind too. The way the image is captured on the sensor and the processor is different. And this goes to show not every single camera is the same, even in the same picture profile. And this is something I thought was interesting too, because I thought S-Cinetone would look very close color-wise on these two cameras, since they're both made from Sony and Sony's picture profile as Cinetone. But they're not, as you can see here. So even shooting as Cinetone, there's still going to be some color correction and matching going on there. But I think here, in my opinion, the FX6 and S-Cinetone looks a little more natural straight out of camera, but it doesn't take very much at all to tweak the A7 IV to look very close to the FX6 and just be a great image overall. Some things that are drawbacks to the A7 IV as a B cam to the FX6, and these are big things we need to talk about. First of all, if you need slow motion, there is a crop on the A7 IV that crops into at Super 35 mode, which a lot of people threw fits about this, and I can see why. If this is your A cam, that could be a problem. But the FX6 has some great slow motion frame rate options, so that is not necessarily an issue to me. I did not care about that. That was a lot of people's big issues with the A7 IV, was the frame rates and slow motion. But if you're looking at for a B cam to FX6, you kind of already got some great slow motion already built into that camera that is in full frame. Now, what is weird about the FX6, and this is honestly one of my biggest problems with it, is you can't do Super 35 mode in 4K. It switches over to 1080, and I don't really know why that is. I think it's because the pixels aren't there when it crops in or down. I don't know. I need to look into why exactly that is. I'm sure someone in the comments probably knows. If they do, let me know, because it's frustrating. But and this is actually another pro to the A7 IV. If you have a lot of APS-C lenses, you can use those APS-C lenses as a B cam as well to your FX6, to where I normally don't get to use my APS-C E-mount lenses because I have to switch over to 1080p, and I'm not willing to do that. So I can shoot in 4K Super 35 on my A7 IV if I need to use those lenses, or just have those options to use those lenses. So back to the other con of this camera. There's a lot of people going back and forth on this online. Some people say they've had issues with it. Some people say they haven't. It overheats. It has overheated on me once. I've got the warning multiple times, but it has actually overheated and shut down on me during a client shoot. So it honestly takes one time for me to lose trust in the whole camera overall. So at this point, I have lost trust in long form shooting on this camera if it's going to be a warm situation. It does pretty well in air conditioned rooms, and I trust it there. Ever since that happened, I go into each shoot now, not 100% trusting this camera, but most of the time if I'm doing sit down talking interviews is where I'll use the B cam, and it's just kind of something to cut around to and just have another angle for visual interest, or to just kind of cut things out and keep the pacing and flow right of the interview itself or the video film, whatever it may be, the importance of a B cam. But the one time it did overheat on me, it was a very long day, and what we were doing was shooting a video podcast. If we call podcasts have videos nowadays, I keep saying podcast, but like it was video podcast. And we were batch shooting for our client. So we were rolling for probably about 4 or 5 hours that day before it actually overheated on me. And we had the AC turned off. So it was a pretty large room, but it did get pretty warm quick in there. So it was a warm setting and it was a long day, but it did overheat and shut down on me. Luckily, it wasn't detrimental to the project, and we were able to finish with one camera for the last 20 minutes of a podcast. So not a big deal. These are reasons why I bought the A7 IV, because it's a lot cheaper than the FX3. I think it's a great B cam to the Sony FX6, especially when you're comparing it to the price of the FX3, which is just shy of $4,000, and this you can get for $2,500. You could possibly grab it used for around $2,000 on eBay or the used market, Facebook Marketplace. If you keep an eye out, you can probably get a good deal on these. But with the overheating issue I had and some other features, I do think the FX3, if you can swing it, is a better B cam. But like I said before, the best B cam to your A cam is another A cam. So there are some drawbacks when saving money for the A7 IV, but it does make a great B cam to the FX6. So if you guys have any questions or are using the A7 IV as a B cam to anything, or is the A7 IV your A cam to your B cam FX6, let me know what you're using in the comments below. Are you mixing and matching? Before I had this, I had two Blackmagic 4Ks, and matching those to the FX6 was pretty frustrating. You could do it, just took some finessing, but the A7 IV gets me closer, and having the S-Log 3 color profile to match the FX6 quicker and easier just made more sense to me. So, well, thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one.